Usually, Pride is a time we come together to celebrate. With everything going on in the world today, we felt we should make space for the Black Lives Matter movement by having a discussion on the parallels between Black Lives Matter movement and the gay liberation movement. With that being said, Pride Reflections will give you a brief history of the civil rights movement and the gay liberation movement and expand the discussion on the intersectionality of these two movements.
The people shown here are the ones who came together and created this presentation. Their voices are the ones you will be hearing. As we know, this year has been quite different than years past. 1, we are experiencing a global pandemic that no one has ever seen before. And 2, we're seeing civil injustice and innocent killings of Black and brown people. Global protests have ensued, framing this year's Pride Month on the focus for Black Lives Matter and actions against police brutality. So we ask you, what does Pride look like in 2020? Black Lives Matter is currently the most important civil rights movement happening today. There are parallels of the current protests fighting for civil rights and the Stonewall Inn uprising in 1969, sparking the gay liberation movement. We believe this is a conversation that needs to be heard now more than ever. It will serve as a time for us to come together virtually to learn and teach each other.
So, like Chris alluded to earlier, when we're talking about Pride and Black Lives Matter, we tend to think of them as separate things. We think of the LGBTQ community and Black Americans as distinct, protected classes of people. So mobilization across these seemingly self-interested groups looks siloed from the outside. In reality, though, the goals of each group build upon one another. Every movement, be it the Gay Liberation Front or the Black Civil Rights Movement of the 50s and 60s, has members who live at the intersection of oppressions and are keen to the fact that each event of resistance has contributed towards civil rights protections that benefit the greater group. Before we start having this conversation, we want to provide a historical primer. So if you see this timeline, it isn't really to scale, but at a high level, we see 246 years of slavery, 99 years of Jim Crow, 56 years of de facto segregation, which continues on today. There was also an overlapping period of around 280 years where homosexuality was criminalized from colonial times through 2003. It's important to note that the colonial sodomy laws didn't target an LGBTQ community as we know it today, but they were the foundation of anti-LGBTQ law in the United States. In another 100 years, we see one of the most significant resistance events in the United States history, which is Nat Turner's Rebellion. This was the biggest slave rebellion to date in the US and led to laws prohibiting the education of enslaved and free Black people. These slave rebellions, many inspired by the Haitian Revolution, which took place at the start of the 1800s, were considered by many to be the origin point of much modern-day activism in the US. We follow this by Juneteenth, the medicalization of sexual identity starting in the Victorian era that would lead to the categorization of homosexuality as a mental disorder, when the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders was created in the 50s. Homosexuality would remain in the DSM until 1973. We also see the beginning of a long and incomplete journey to undo some of this institutionalized oppression. We see the Civil Rights Act of 1964, then we go on to the eventual decriminalization of homosexuality in 2003, like mentioned before, and the legalization of same-sex marriage in 2015. We also see the workplace anti-discrimination protections against LGBTQ people that were secured this year in 2020 with the extension of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, so that it will cover gay and trans people. This is a really good example of how these goals and movements build upon one another.
The modern LGBTQ+ rights movement started as a response to increasing police harassment and criminalization following World War II, and it had direct parallels with the civil rights movement. Under an anti-gay legal system, LGBTQ spaces from the 1940s to 60s were often raided, with customers being arrested and having their names exposed in newspapers. The police abused, lost, or harassed LGBTQ+ people for being who they were, just as Black Americans endured brutal treatment just for the color of their skin. This shared concern and struggle of combating police brutality brought together Black and LGBTQ+ activists. This timeline highlights some key events and intersection between both movements. So on August 28th, 1963, we have the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This was a march to advocate for the civil and economic rights of Black Americans, where nearly 250,000 people marched, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave his historic I Have a Dream speech that called for the end of racism. Bayard Rustin, an openly gay civil rights leader and advisor for Martin Luther King, was a chief organizer of the march, but is largely forgotten about due to his sexual orientation, which rendered him to work behind the scenes, and he was rarely allowed to serve as a spokesperson. This leads up to the Stonewall riots in June 28, 1969. Stonewall Inn was a bar that was routinely raided by the police, and on this particular night, people have had enough of the unjust raids and arrests. One customer was being beaten by police and forced into a paddy wagon, and they exclaimed, "Why don't you people do something?" to the crowd, which sparked the riots. They were led by Black and brown trans women, specifically Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, and it happened over the course of 5 nights where thousands of people gathered to protest the unjust police raiding and brutality. This led to the founding of the Gay Liberation Front, who organized the first Lives Pride March, the Christopher Street Liberation Day, that happened on the anniversary of the night of the first riots. This drew thousands of people to march in New York City and LA, and these people gathered to protest the laws that made being LGBTQ+ illegal and the social conditions that often made it impossible for them to maintain jobs or rent apartments. And we have on June 25th, 1978, the debut of the rainbow flag at the San Francisco Freedom Day. It was designed by American artist and activist Gilbert Baker, who was challenged by his friend and influential gay leader Harvey Milk to come up with a new symbol of pride for the community. On March 24th, 1987, we have the first ACT UP demonstration on Wall Street. ACT UP was an organization that stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, and it was founded in New York City in 1987 to effect change and bring widespread attention to the AIDS crisis. Their first demonstration took place during rush hour on Wall Street and targeted pharmaceutical companies that were profiteering from the AIDS epidemic, and this led to the FDA announcing it would shorten its drug approval process by 2 years, a process that normally took up to 9. Then we have the LA riots of 1992, which started on April 29th and ended on May 4th. This began after a trial jury acquitted 4 police officers of the LAPD for using excessive force in the arrest and beating of Rodney King. King's brutal beating was filmed by a bystander who released it to the local news, and it was ultimately broadcasted worldwide and was one of the first instances of the world seeing how unjust police brutality was. This ignited a national conversation about racial and economic disparity and police brutality that still runs rampant today. We have the Ferguson unrest, which were a series of protests in Ferguson, Missouri that started the day after a police officer shot and killed Michael Brown, an unarmed 18-year-old Black man. Protesters were met with brutality by SWAT teams and riot police who used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse gatherings, much like we are seeing today. And this invigorated the modern Black Lives Matter movement and highlighted the discrimination that minorities see with the criminal justice system on a daily basis. This all leads up to what is happening today with the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter protests. The death of George Floyd at the hands of police sparked demonstrations and protests in over 2,000 U.S. cities and around the world against police brutality and racism. More specifically, 15,000 people marched from Brooklyn for a Black Trans Lives Matter march on June 14th of this year. Black trans people are often the most marginalized and the most vulnerable within this community. 14 reported murders of Black trans people since the beginning of 2020, a number which is largely undercounted. Black trans individuals are 7 times more likely to experience physical violence when dealing with the police, and nearly half of all Black trans people have been incarcerated, a direct result of the marginalization within their own communities.
This visual timeline of protests and freedom of speech speaks volumes on how change is made. If you take a closer look, half of these photos are from different time periods in history. However, there are comparisons across these photos highlighting people of different ages, genders, races, and ethnicities. Even though these photos are recent, protest is nothing new to marginalized communities and allies. Protest and marching is sewn into the fabric for change. These historic and visual parallels support our message that LGBTQ+ liberation is rooted in Black liberation.
With intersectionality being so present between both major events, you truly cannot have one without the other. The definition of intersectionality, for those of you who may not know, is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, as they apply to individuals or a group. It forms the framework for understanding how aspects combine to create unique modes of discrimination and privilege. To many conservatives, it means because you're a minority, you get special standards or special treatment. But with the brutal shootings and general and blatant discriminations that people of color and the LGBTQ plus community have faced, that's clearly not the reality. It's also worth noting that Black and brown trans women are also in the center of these movements. They are particularly vulnerable as they are not only members of the trans community, but also face discrimination as people of color and are also often poor. In 2018, according to the Human Rights Campaign, 26 transgender people suffered violent deaths. A majority of them were Black trans women. In 2019, 7 transgender people were violently killed. All of them were Black trans women, according to the HRC. So there is strength in numbers. So what is allyship? Allyship is the process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with individuals and within groups of people that are usually marginalized. By standing in solidarity and being allies to oppressed minority groups, we can give them all voices and help them be heard.
From these recent headlines, we are seeing change being made. It takes strength in numbers for people in charge to make decisions. This is what Pride looks like in 2020. Thank you for taking the time to listen to our Pride Reflections presentation. We also want to thank Biolumina for giving us this platform to teach and learn from each other. Here, we listed some ways you at home can take action.